the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we do want to mention briefly we have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. We don't put anything behind a paywall, so it's all completely voluntary. Today, Taylor and I are really excited to bring you a returning guest, Thomas Nail. He currently teaches at the University of Denver and has written an extensive number of works, things on Lucretius. Primarily, today we're going to be looking at his forthcoming book, Matter and Motion, A Brief History of Kinetic Materialism. First of all, just a hearty welcome back to the show, Thomas. We're really excited to discuss this book with you.
Thanks, guys. It's awesome to be back. I had a really great time in our last conversation. So yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, we couldn't even say primarily Lucretius. It's just that you've dedicated like a triptych, right? A trilogy to Lucretius.
Yeah, I should have said motion.
Well, I mean, motion. You know, it's a movement, right? I mean, yeah. I guess that's like the theory of the border, theory of the migrant. Maybe that was, and maybe you could trace it back to your dissertation work, which we talked about a little bit last time you were here, but a kind of nomadic anarchism, whatever. So you've already, maybe we were going to ask you about the genesis of this work. So maybe there is a thread in terms of motion, matter and motion. Like, was that already apparent to you when you started doing your PhD work, or is that something that just kind of came out of your interests?
It came out of interest, but it was definitely sort of post-dissertation thematic work. I finished the book on Zapatismo, and then I spent a year working with this migrant justice group known as Illegal in Toronto and researching immigration and doing activist stuff. And from that came to realize that emotion was a lot more important than I thought it was, and especially migration. That was, so the beginning started with political theory, and then in researching the political theory and writing the books, Theory of the Border and Figure of the Migrant, I realized it was a lot bigger than just a political issue, that it was really a kind of deep historical, ontological, epistemological. It just involved everything, and it kind of just set me on this course of following that really simple idea that motion was possibly primary, and then, writing a bunch of books kind of following out the consequences of that really different position. Along the way, there were kind of two big series of books. I mean, at this point, it's kind of a lot. One of them were kind of like these books on politics, aesthetics, science, ontology. And the other side was a question that I had in doing the work was like, okay, so if the West has really, committed itself to this worldview against motion, is there anybody inside the Western tradition that didn't go along with that was different in some way? And so I taught this class called The Philosophy of Movement for several years in a row as a way to test out. I'm like, I had some hunches about who in the West would be really different. And I thought, oh, for sure, it's going to be the process philosophers, Whitehead, Bergson, Deleuze. And of course, that's, the Deleuzean inspiration. It comes out of my work on Deleuze. So I thought for sure he'd be in there. And, by the end of teaching that class, I kind of tried out everybody I thought, and some other figures fell out along the way. But for me, the condition was really that whatever thinker it was in the Euro-Western tradition that was going to be very different, they'd have to commit to a kind of three ideas. And those are the three ideas developed in detail in this book, the Matter and Motion, A Brief History of Kinetic Materialism. So that book is out. It's available now. And the goal of it was to kind of develop what those three ideas were, like really specifically: indeterminacy, relationality, and process. How that's connected to materialism is another question, but those are the three ideas that I thought, if anybody is going to be into materialism and motion, it's got to be from this perspective that makes it fundamentally different than any other form of materialism or any other theory of motion in the West. And that turned out to be Lucretius, Marx, and Virginia Woolf. And the Woolf book is done, but it's still under review. It'll be out at some point. But those are the figures for me that really, inside the West, were quite different from this perspective. And the reason they were different, and this is what kind of brought about this book in particular, was that they came out of a certain tradition. The moderns, Woolf and Marx, came directly from Lucretius, his idea of the swerve. And before that, this book is trying to figure out, surely Lucretius was not the only or first one to ever come up with the idea that motion was radically indeterminate and primary ontologically. And so this book is kind of tracing that story and kind of synthesizing and telling the story in a very brief form. That's kind of introduction to my books on Marx, Woolf, and Lucretius, but also just a way of asking the question, where did this whole perspective come from? And it actually goes quite deep. And this book just explores it all the way back to the sort of pre-Indo-European Minoan tradition. So the Minoans were, well, whatever, we talked about them, but it traces back to Minoans, Homer, Hesiod, then to Lucretius, and then Marx and Woolf. And that's kind of the ancient and modern trajectory. Right. And then to a little bit of quantum physics stuff, like figures who have accepted this idea to some degree in their interpretation of quantum physics. So basically spanning all that time period. That's to say, there's a bigger project I won't go into now, but is tracing this even farther back in time and further geographically outside the West. But this book is just kind of looking at that Western tradition and its origins.
That's great. And you did open up to some of the questions I had. And I did see in one of the footnotes that you've also got a book on chaos coming out. So I assume that that's also involved with these studies. And maybe that was the book you were just referring to, or that could be, perhaps that's another one.
Yeah, you guys are going to love this one. I just think you're going to love this one. Like, you guys in particular are going to love this. I mean, it's not out yet, but it's done.
I almost emailed you. I was like, hey, I want to see the chaos book, but I thought,
it's awesome.
I thought, let's keep it to this one. We'll give this book its due, and we can wait, obviously have you back. I'll start with this because you brought up the Minoans. It was interesting to see how, you developed the book. Obviously, you said you've got the three ideas: indeterminacy, relationality, process, and pattern, right? Maybe that's together, but maybe that's four, maybe that's 3.5. I don't know. But who's counting, right? Yeah. But I did want to ask, and then along the way, you do an ancient and modern section for each chapter, or you break each part into 2 chapters. I like the that thematic organization, but I did want to ask, it made sense seeing Lucretius, right? You've done extensive work, as Coop mentioned at the start of the show. We had you on last time for Marx and Motion, so it wasn't surprising to see those figures. To give you a chance for the ancient and the modern on one on each side, it was interesting to see you focus so much on the Minoans in each of the chapters. And then Virginia Woolf, which you said, and I think you mentioned in your work that you've got a forthcoming book on Virginia Woolf. So maybe we can start by what prompted you to sort of devote your energy into studying the Minoans, how that ties in, because it was interesting to see that forefronted and do a lot of the legwork through each chapter. And so it kind of set up the evolution of the ideas. And so I guess that start with the Minoans. Maybe we can get to Woolf. I don't want to ask too much at once, but yeah, tell us a little bit about that interest.
I started working back from Lucretius. The bigger picture point here is that there's quite a lot of material on new materialism at this point, but it's interesting, like this word matter. I mean, there's really nothing especially new about the idea that matter has agency. I mean, it's new relative to the Europeans, but I mean, historically and geographically, this is not exactly a totally new idea. But tracing that back in time and geographically around is a much bigger project, and not a lot of European new materialists have taken that. I mean, frankly, they haven't. I think many of them haven't gone back. I'm surprised to see, even dealing with just Aristotle's definition of matter. I mean, it just as a historical starting point, wherever you go from there. But Aristotle's got a pretty good, interesting definition of matter. I mean, Hule in his Physics. I mean, it's a short section. It's only a couple pages, but he just lays out there. He's like, yeah, matter's totally indeterminate. It's a logon. You can't say anything about it. You can't know it. It's a oriston. It's without boundary or limit. And you're like, yeah, that's great. I mean, he's kind of missing a little bit of the agency part of it because he makes it passive with respect to form. That's a problem. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but starting with indeterminacy is a really key part of thinking about what matter is. So I tried to trace it back with the word matter, and take that back and look at what Aristotle says, because he invents this word basically. And why did it come from trees?
That was fascinating. You're focused on etymology. We'll get to the Minoans in a second, but that was fascinating seeing some of you put a lot of stock into the etymology, and obviously that can take us down a Heideggerian mysticism and return type of thing. But you really do bring out something interesting with that. For example, Hule is related to trees, wood. Even, am I wrong? I'm trying to remember the word that Lucretius used, which you talked about last time you were here, corpora, right? For quote unquote bodies or material things. It actually is from the hard core of trees, the trunk, or maybe the hardwood. I'm trying to remember if I'm.
Yeah, it's one of the examples given in the Latin dictionary of what could be a body. I mean, this is just a contrast because people often think that Lucretius is talking about atoms, even though the word is never used in the text. And I find that so just mystifying, and I think most scholars are willing to just look past it, be like, yeah, but he meant that for sure, because he uses words like semina, that has to do with seeds, and Epicurus also kind of calls them seeds. He tracks so closely to Epicurus in some ways, you just wonder why he doesn't do it, why he just doesn't say it. And it bothers me and raises questions about how accurate it is to say that Lucretius was an atomist. In any case, but the point is that when Lucretius he has many words for matter, and one of them is corpora. It doesn't necessarily mean like billiard balls or something, the example. When you look in the dictionary, it's clear that the Latin original sense of that word doesn't mean billiard balls. It just means bodily. But all kinds of things can be bodily, and one of the examples in the dictionary is the body of a tree, like the trunk of a tree. That can be bodily, but that's typically not the image people think of when they see the word corpora. Literally, the English translations just translate corpora as atom. Yeah, and that's not right.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I know that there's this phrase. I'm paraphrasing, but in 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari talk about how a lot of things are bodies we might not imagine. They even consider, what are the list of things they say? They even say like ideas are bodies or minds are bodies, all this shit. Right. It doesn't matter. Coop, you can cut that out because I have to go look at the passage now. I'm trying to remember. But
well, I mean, even something like body of the earth, I think, would be a unconventional description of a body.
Sure, yeah. That gets us back to anti-Oedipus, but yeah, no, you're right. I mean, we could obviously. I had at least one stock Deleuze question for later, but I did want to give you a chance to talk about the Minoans. So you work back from Lucretius. Did you work to Lucretius or work back to Lucretius from Marx, or did you find out by happenstance Marx's dissertation, which, as we talked about last time, wasn't really translated or even released in the original German till late, right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the stuff really kind of started, when I was in this class teaching it, trying to look at these figures. I knew of, through Deleuze, of Michel Serres' book, and read Michel Serres' book. And I was like, oh, I'm going to teach some Lucretius and see what there is. And that's when I got hung up on this whole, God, was he really an atomist thing? And looking at the translations and realizing that he was way more interesting. And the swerve was such a more important idea and much more akin to quantum stuff, I think, than Michel Serres ever really understood. Michel Serres takes it into the thermodynamic sciences, but he never touches quantum physics. And I think that was really a limit of his and Deleuze's thinking on this question of the swerve, because you can look in the literature and it's cited, I mean, in this book, Matter and Motion. That's another key piece I wanted to connect. It's not just these philosophers. There are contemporary quantum physicists who have at least taken the time to read some Lucretius and then understand that, oh yeah, what he was saying about the swerve, which is incerto tempore, incertisque locis, like it's indeterminate time and indeterminate place. It's not a spatial temporal concept. I mean, it's it's not in space and time in that sense. So you can't think about movement or process or swerves, that they're just like, a linear thing moving along in space and then suddenly it takes a turn. That's not what the swerve is. So anyway, there's several and they're cited in there, and I found another one since this book. But physicists who credit Lucretius for basically giving a description of quantum indeterminacy before the fact. And to me, that's an important connection that connects Lucretius as an ancient to contemporary sciences, which in their own way answer this question. But I started with Lucretius, and then I'm trying to how it is that I got to Marx exactly. I had a feeling Marx would be on this page, but I think it was actually Keith Ansel Pearson at a conference who told me about he told me about a footnote in Deleuze's Nietzsche book where Deleuze mentions Marx's dissertation, and actually in not a positive way at all. In the footnote, Deleuze says, this is why Marx and Lucretius are both wrong in their materialism, and Nietzsche is better than them both. I totally didn't remember this little footnote, but when I went back, I was like, oh my God, not only did Deleuze really pay attention to Lucretius in a serious way that many people were not at that time in the 70s, that he even knew about Marx's dissertation, which he must have read in German, because I don't think it was translated into French. But he read that dissertation earlier and took it seriously and understood fully that Marx was identifying himself with Lucretius in this way. And I think that was the thing that might have got me started down this path, then reading Marx's dissertation and kind of being blown away by his just absolutely unrepentant affirmation of the indeterminacy of the swerve. And some quotes he says where he's like, everything is absolute motion and swerving. And I'm like, whoa, man, that's, I know people listening to this show and other people who have, done peer reviews of my books, stuff like, oh, but, surely so-and-so, I mean, trot out the name of one of these people that they think might fit into this. And I'm always open to hear new names, but I have to say, I've looked at a lot of names, and I really do require, for it to be in this group of selected individuals, you really have to commit to absolute ontological indeterminacy and absolute motion, not deterministic motion, not swerves in space and time, but absolute indeterminacy. And to think that that's what matter and motion are, I think is genuinely a rare philosophical position in the West. We could get to Deleuze later, but I also don't think Deleuze fully, it's at least ambiguous where he lies on this. I think he comes in and out. But let's talk about Deleuze at a separate point.
Yeah.
The conclusion of this is tracing it back to the Minoans, which is the original question.
I love it. We had to do the spiral. We had to practice the spiral motion captured in some of this ancient Cretan art, right? That we get beautiful reproductions of in your book. So we're seeing the line, and it is interesting that it was circuitous to get to Marx's dissertation, but also to get to looking at Lucretius, even as you do in your books in the Latin, go back to the source through Sayre, which is great, because around the time, I guess it was maybe a little bit after we had you on last, right before we did the dissertation, almost like preparing, for our talk. And then a few months later, we did the Birth of Physics. As you said, it focuses so much on the turbulence, but it doesn't go down to the quantum level, which I'm sure Sayre would have been equipped to handle. But again, in any case, so
I do wonder about that. I don't wonder. Yeah, well, I mean, it's a mystery for me. And every Michel Sayre scholar I encounter, I always ask him this question: why didn't he get into quantum physics? He must have read things about it. He must have had some sense, but I can't find anywhere where he actually engages with it. And that's always a surprise to me.
He's obviously a brilliant guy. He would have had the wherewithal he would have been well suited to bring together the science and the philosophy, right? That's among other things, that's one of the things we love about his polymath aspect. But in any case, the Minoans, So how did this evolve? This interest in the Minoans, was it an epiphany or ancillary, just a fortuitous encounter, or it could have been more of an intuition? Do you recall this other rabbit hole, I guess, or did it follow from these? I mean, you said, look, you trace back from Lucretius, but that couldn't have been, was that directly in De Re Natura, or was that just a hunch?
It is totally a spiral. Lucretius and then like Marx via Deleuze, and then I want to say that maybe it was Woolf, and of course like, you know, Karen Barad. And after I had traced enough of those, I was like, wait a minute, is Lucretius really the first? And that sent me back to then looking. It's definitely not going to be Aristotle or Plato, but tracing back the idea or proto ideas of matter through Hule with Aristotle and the Kora with Plato. I know those aren't strictly, with Plato, it's not strictly identical to matter in the same sense as Aristotle, but it's definitely, everybody agrees that it's probably some kind of related precursor. And I think it's related just landscape geography wise, it's the countryside. But those were the two cues. Once I traced it to Aristotle and Plato, I was like, okay, so why is it? And I asked like the Plato scholar here in my department, I'm like, why do you think of all the things that Aristotle could have said matter was, why did he say it was like a tree or wood? Why wood? I mean, dirt, come on, water, like all kinds of stuff. I mean, the physicoi, like all of the pre-Socratic, I mean, they gave all these kind of elemental definitions, but why did Aristotle pick wood? And I mean, I haven't found anybody like giving a serious answer to that question. It's going to be speculative by its nature a little bit. Right. I think Plato's idea of the Kora is because the Kora is not just some abstract nurse or receptacle as it is in the Timaeus. The Kora was just a Greek word that meant like the countryside, you know? I mean, it was the undivided pasture lands of the forests that really abounded in archaic Greece before the rise of, you know, the city-states and classical Greek, whatever, you know, period for Plato and Aristotle. They, during their lifetime, watched increasingly the natural environment being destroyed, and I think associated still that outside the polis choral space as a space of nourishment and support for the city. And in that way, Plato kind of metaphysicalizes the idea of the countryside, which includes trees. So it got me thinking about those like very foresty tree outside places as sources in the Greek, classical Greek imagination of what matter was about. Because they could have picked anything, but they didn't. They picked something that very much had to do with a forested outdoor countryside, possibly mountainous region. So then that got me thinking about, well, what about Hesiod, which there are some connections. People often think about chaos as a connection to matter. That's how I got into the Chaos Project, but that's another one. But before that, Homer has all these descriptions too. Homer doesn't talk about materialism or matter directly in those ways. But what's interesting to look at is the way that Homer talks about the countryside and the trees and the mountains. And so I was trying to basically trace back these proto versions of matter in the West, ended up tracing them back because a major influence on Lucretius is two sources. One, Greek philosophy, no doubt. He read a lot of that stuff and it influenced him. The other one was archaic Greek poetry. These are his two main influences. So if we want to understand what he was thinking about when he was writing, it's important not just to go look at Epicurus and say, well, he was saying that. He wasn't just saying that. He was influenced by the poetic tradition. He's writing a poem. It's important to remember it's a piece of poetry, and it invokes all of the mythological themes that he knew of from all of the poets. But where they got many of their images was from the Minoans in Crete. Okay, so there's often distorted and there's not a clear connection because we're dealing with a pretty big gap in textual materials between the Minoans and Homer. So the Minoans did have a script. They didn't use it in the same way. It was mainly for like record keeping. It's called linear A. We don't have an interpretation.
We
have not broken the code for linear A, but linear B is the first uncoded kind of proto-Greek language that mentions the gods and so on for the first time. That linear B language it's related clearly to linear A, and you can see many of the same sort of things going on and names. And anyway, it happens. It's because a group of Mycenaeans arrive and conquer the Minoans and then produce this hybrid religious, cultural, linguistic, all these things are hybridized. So the Greek gods are essentially are very much hybrid versions of Indo-European Mycenaeans who have arrived in the Aegean area and longstanding Minoan mythology, which we don't have any written text, but we have lots of amazing archaeological evidence. And so that's the thing that led me back to the Minoans was it's not a text. And so I do the best job and try to cite the Minoan scholars that I feel are authoritative on those issues, especially the ones you can see that are interested in thinking about the Minoans from a what's the word, like a non-Eurocentric perspective, which is very hard because that is kind of the history of Minoan archaeology, is Europeans basically wanting to call Minoans the first Europeans, and everybody from the hippies to the fascists, everybody wants to identify with the Minoans. The articles that I found are ones that are really trying to think about, because the cool thing about the Minoans is there's no images that are unambiguously pictures of gods or deities. They've got no temples, like built architectural structures that you would say this is like a temple to this god. They don't have any figures in their art that are unambiguously like heroes. In fact, many of the figures don't have any faces. Sometimes they don't even have any heads. It's just a little stump. There's all these like very weird things about them that do not line up with the typical stories we know. When you look at what was going on in Mesopotamia or even Egypt, you can look and see stuff. It's obviously these are gods. They're deities. These anthropologists and archaeologists are looking at the Minoans from a kind of new animist perspective. And one of them looking directly at them from a process philosophy perspective, that we're dealing with animate, agential processes in nature that do not clearly line up with gods or heroes or deities in the sense of transcendence. That to me was provocative, as well as their art, which is filled with spirals and all kinds of ambiguous, metamorphosed, partially human, partially animal, partially insect figures that there's just not. There's a little bit of that in Egypt, but it's not even close to what the Minoans were. I mean, the Minoan stuff is just weird. It's very weird, and it doesn't fit in that story. It exerts an influence on that Greek tradition, but clearly the Greeks eventually head more in the path of the Mycenaeans. I'm sorry, this is like way too long of an answer, but the point is, the Minoans, I felt there was archaeological evidence worth marshaling to suggest that they might have had, their worldview might have been much closer to one of indeterminacy and relationality, and thinking about the world as processes, patterns that emerge, as opposed to objective forms outside of space and time shaping matter in the way that Aristotle thought, or thinking that everything was fire or everything was water, or whatever the early Greek philosophers. There's not really any clear archaeological evidence that was what they were thinking. There's just lots of images of people, and evidence of them taking drugs, going into caves, being outside, but no gods, no temples. What's going on here?
All of this is good. And at the end of the book, when I was thinking about the way in which each part is at the very forefront, we're going to dive into, before seeing the modern take on each concept, right? Indeterminacy, relationality, process. We get the Minoan, we get the Minoan beginnings, if you will, the earliest origins that we have records of, so to speak. What I was thinking about was how, to begin to untether ourselves or pull away from this representational type of thinking that, as you just mentioned, that prioritizes or hierarchizes beings, objects, etc., right? All the stuff that you're trying to nudge us away from in kinetic materialism. I thought about how, and you just mentioned it, right? How looking at the religious practices that involve intoxication, I mean, it is interesting that, and I'm just thinking about, I can't remember the title of this book. I read it when I was a kid. Came out in the 70s by this doctor who, was one of the only ones licensed to work with certain like psychoactive drugs, including marijuana. And it was about how sober thinking, so to speak, conventionally speaking, can lock us into ways of seeing reality as determinate, right? Reality as discrete, reality as stable, et cetera, all the prejudices, if you will, that we can see throughout the history of thought and whatnot. So I guess that was something that I was thinking about, how you don't come out and kind of highlight or emphasize it, but you do implicitly sort of give some credence to the fact that these experiments these experiences with intoxication, ecstasy, et cetera, this Dionysian element, if you will, is part and parcel of some of the concepts and ideas that you're trying to promote. I'm not necessarily saying that, you just go and take drugs and then you'll see indeterminacy, relationality, blah, 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 but that there is perhaps something intuitively, holistically related And we can see that in the Minoans and the Eleusinians, etc. Am I kind of in the ballpark?
Yeah. I mean, you got your Jordan Petersons, who take psychedelics and come away with like absolutely bonkers ideas of white supremacy. Totally possible, but I mean, it's like, these are amplifiers of experience, and so the context really matters. So in the case of, and this is part of the Chaos book and it's another side project to sort of trace this, but I will say this, that the cultures who historically have the commitment to movement as being ontologically primary and as indeterminate also have this kind of relational epistemology. And if you think about, I mean, of course you can, deny it or whatever and say that's not what's important about it. And I think that's basically what, Plato and Socrates do when they, effectively take LSD and go to the, rites of Eleusis. There's a book called The Immortality Key that came out like maybe a couple of years ago, but the book has evidence in there as close as we're ever going to get that inside those ritual vessels at Eleusis, which was about 15 miles northwest of Athens, people would go drink from a ritual glass and the koukion, and they would have all these experiences, and they weren't allowed to talk about them. I don't want to get fully into the story of Eleusis, or I'll go on forever. But the point is that, but like almost every Greek did this. We now have some pretty good archaeological evidence, including finding ergot inside the teeth of the skulls of leftovers at these sites it wasn't exactly Eleusis, but it was like they iterated versions of Eleusis. It wasn't just there, but like they kind of franchised it, and other people like went out and made their own Eleusis. They copied all the architecture. They did all the same rituals and things like that, as well as a koukion. We have a Greek-style koukion with ergot traces in it from archaeochemical analysis, which people have only been able to do archaeochemical analysis, I don't know, for the last 15 years or something. But if you think about so much we've lost historically, because when archaeologists find artifacts, they acid wash them to prevent decay. But when you acid wash them, you basically remove all the traces of whatever the foodstuffs or drinks that people were drinking. Anyway, Immortality Key is a great book that goes through all of the drugs that the Greeks were on. And I'll just sum it up and say they were on a lot of different drugs. And it's what was in Dionysus's wine is way crazier than what you think it is. It was only kind of wine. I mean, they used to use wine as like the base to put in all kinds of other herbs, including opium, hemp, and henbane, and all kinds of other psychoactive chemicals. But we know that the Minoans there's lots of images of them with poppies, clearly These are corn poppies. The point is, you can deny that that's what's going on, but at a very basic level, the idea that you're seriously getting any kind of knowledge from any plant substance, it's just fundamentally a relational kind of character. And you can say, like maybe Socrates, who, drank the koukion and came away thinking that everything was, well, Plato really, and Pythagoras too, that like everything was ideal forms outside of space and time. The visuals produced by that kind of experience might suggest a kind of geometricism. So he might have said, oh, well, the drugs allowed him to get to that vision, but that's just because the vision was already there. One other way of thinking about the longer history of people around the world using psychoactive plants and things like that, it's fundamentally relational. There's something that the plant is, you only learn through the plant. The plant is teaching you something in some way. And if you only know through the plant, then it's a kind of hybrid human plant knowledge that's happening. So there is an argument for a kind of a relational epistemology it doesn't have to be this version, because there's lots of versions of relational epistemology. I mean, observing a double slit, doing a double slit experiment and making an observation, there's a relational epistemology there too. You don't need opium for that, or poppies or whatever. But historically, lots of these people who I've tracked and looked at the texts also have built-in structures of psychoactive plant use as a way to engage and know something about the nature of the world. And you can see a pretty big division as time goes on. That starts to be less of a good idea. And it starts to be, actually, that's the big problem. And classical Greece is one of those points in this particular geography where suddenly intoxication is like no longer access. It's actually like a deterrent or a confusion. It allows the senses to distort your rational capacities. Basically, the rise of kind of Greek Enlightenment and Greek rationalism which is way overblown. I think basically what European historians have said about Greek rationalism, it's overblown that the Greeks were somehow these like rational pinnacles. I mean, they were all on all kinds of drugs, and they were still performing all kinds of religious acts and, you know, versions of daily animism that are built into Greek society, even if like maybe Plato didn't have that same view. He was the one that was saying, art is never going to show you the truth. Drugs are not going to show you the truth. Poetry and Homer and all that stuff's going to lead you astray. To me, that's a really big breaking point in this geography, is the relationship to a relational epistemology that has to do with where you are. Are you in a cave? Are you in a forest? Are you listening to the river or whatever? These are all relational features of how you come to know, whether we're talking about animistic agencies and persons of trees and nymphs where you're talking to them. That's part of the relational epistemology. Anyway, I have lots of examples from the book because I think that performative and relational part is also really part of the indeterminacy. Because if you don't know exactly what nature is, and it's not one thing in particular, you can only really kind of know it by doing it. Does that make sense? You can't just like, I'm outside the world looking at it. If you're in it, then you can only know it by being in it. And so the question is, how can you be in it in such a way that you're doing the same thing as it, and therefore glean the knowledge performatively instead of gleaning it in some pretense of objective neutrality? And one way to do that is this longer history of drugs.
If I remember, Coop, when we were at the end of the concert with King Gizzard, the concert, he's like, all right, kids, go take LSD or something like that. Right. And I mean, it's just like, yeah, there's a sense in which you gotta, at some point, you gotta do it. But that's what I was talking about, like getting locked into super thinking, ways of altering our quote unquote normal modes of thinking, which I think is why Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, again, we're not going down the Deleuze road yet, but why they talk about delirium as, you know, it's not about true, false, illusion, fantasy. It's about the lived experience of it. But Cooper, are you going to say something?
We're going to be talking to Henry Summers Hall about focusing on nomadology coming up soon in a couple of days, actually, which I think is, I didn't even make the connection to this discussion in terms of nomadology, but also just thinking about the spice melange, because Thomas, I've become like obsessed after the last episode you came on. I've become obsessed with Dune, which is kind of
that's when you became obsessed with Dune. Okay.
I think
go on.
The new movie got me back into it ultimately. Thinking about the drug, you know, melange, and I guess the whole Atreides tracing the lineage back to Agamemnon, who I believe was Mycenaean, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know, just a lot of kind of weird symmetry or synergy with the sort of web of thought that we're going down this week. I didn't really have a question per se.
I mean, I would just piggyback and say the nomadology, part of what, Thomas, you're doing, if to speak in A Thousand Plateaus language, is there has been and is this royal science that sort of determines and overcodes ways of thinking and knowing and etc. Right. And so there is a kind of a minor science line that we can trace through these thinkers that you've been discussing. And leave that aside, I did want to ask you, following up, because the other figure that I was interested in, tie in Virginia Woolf to this story and why she became one of those thinkers that fits your criteria in this book.
I mean, I was surprised about, I think maybe all three. Maybe Lucretius was not on my first round list, but he was on the second. But Woolf was not, and Marx, I think, was kind of late to when I taught the class. So I was not expecting Marx and Woolf to be on here. I was expecting for sure Bergson, and I don't think that he quite fits this in the same way. And it really does have to do in almost all cases with their fit with Lucretius. So in particular, it's undoubtedly, Woolf did not read Marx's dissertation. So I think that is not a direct connection. I think she read Marx for sure. And, you know, Leonard and all of the Bloomsbury people all read Marx. And so there was that, I'm sure, but that was not the thing. The thing was that Virginia Woolf learned Latin by reading De Rerum Natura. And I actually got a hold of her, and I have it if you want me to send it to you, but I have now a scanned version of her copy, which is actually a version of her father's copy of De Rerum Natura. It's from her personal library. And what she has in it is there's translated sections. She has translated, by learning the Latin, she translates it into English, but it's not the whole book. She didn't translate the entire book into English.
You mentioned that, yeah.
She just translated sections that she thought were really important for some reason. And it is interesting that all three of the moments in De Rerum Natura where Lucretius is clearly outside the Epicurean model here, and he is entering into these states of ecstasy. They are moments in the text where he is explicitly, he says, taking this is in book 1, the thyrsus of Dionysus penetrates his heart. And for him, the heart would have been like the mind, the seat of the mind. Right. So he's essentially kind of, but it's very poetic language, but I mean, come on, if Dionysus is penetrating your heart and mind, and he says then when that happens, his mind begins to grow, like a plant. And then he goes to the mountains of the Muses, presumably in some state of ecstasy, where he then roams around the mountains and looks for flowers and waters that nobody's ever seen before. Nobody's ever drank these waters. Nobody's ever made a crown of flowers for their head with these flowers. So he's telling us both a poetic story of like, I'm going to tell you something that's beautiful, but it's also going to be something you've never heard before in this way. But he does all of it, with drugs. It's a very relational kind of Dionysian moment. And that's a section that Woolf translates. And the other one is in book 3, where Lucretius it's the most kind of ecstatic moment in the whole book. There's no Epicurean that could ever get down with what Lucretius says in that opening, like line 30 or something of book 3, where he says like, oh, I've read all the pages of Epicurus and, like I've drunk them in like a bee or something, drinking nectar from flowers, and I'm spilling it all over the place. And like, that's the point where you're like, whoa, would a serious Epicurean scholar say that they were like spilling over like the page, that this was some kind of like drunken ecstasy as opposed to a serious scholar. Right. Lucretius was not a serious scholar of Epicurus. He was influenced, no doubt, but the seriousness of his scholarship in this passage is seriously questionable. And the notes in the Loeb edition, the editors are like, this can't be right. He must have said this wrong because he's sounding like he's not a serious Epicurean here. Right, but he's not. Okay, so, but then he drinks all of the pages, and he basically his body starts shaking and shivering, and he says, like, I see before me the entire nature of things unravel before my eyes, and I go into this like shivering ecstasy. And Woolf translates that section, nothing else in that around it. My point is, the thing that got me into reading Woolf actually was because I was investigating all the connections of Lucretius, how people had received him, what they did with him. Most people, almost everybody in the Euro West read Lucretius, but most people didn't like it. I mean, they didn't like everything. Right. They couldn't get down with the swerve. I mean, to me, that's it. Really, there's just two kinds of people in that Euro-Western tradition: is you're either down with the swerve or you're not. In the true sense that Lucretius says, the swerve, right? Is it indeterminate, like radically indeterminate? And relational, like all the indeterminate changes are related to one another when matter moves. So either you kind of accept this swerve, or like most Europeans are like, yeah, this is all great, but also God. They've got to sub in God, or like, this is great, but also the soul. And it's like, well, no, there is no immaterial soul. You do not get this kind of Christian deist, whatever version. That's what the Europeans did to Lucretius when they got a hold of him, except for Marx, who really pushes the envelope in a unique way. And then Woolf, who basically accepts, and I think her emphasis is, Marx is more focused on the theory of nature and the swerve. And in Woolf, she really kind of zeroes in on the relationship of the swerve and naturalism to what she calls moments of being. I have to say that, I really like Woolf. She's wonderful, and I thought that before, but when I read her unfinished autobiography that she wrote just 2 years before her suicide, she has a section in there where she basically says, this is my philosophy. Nowhere else. In fact, most places she says, yeah, philosophy is not really that great. She has all these critical things to say about kind of analytic British, Bertrand Russell kind of philosophy. She's not interested in that kind of philosophy. She certainly read some of it. But she's like, yeah, I'm not going to read that. But she'll read Lucretius's De Rerum Natura over and over again. And she says her philosophy essentially, and to me, this is like a really big deal for somebody in the Euro West to say that everything is nature. She says all of art, all of it is the thing itself. There's just not a distinction for her between things as they seem and things as they really are. There's just the nature of things. They're always swerving. And for her, she has her autobiographical story is that she has these moments, she calls them moments of being, where she sees, she says, the patterns that are sort of hidden beneath the cotton wool of daily life. So things look like they're discrete, and then actually underneath it all is this process. A really great image that she uses a few times is of like a fishing net with kind of bobbers, corks floating on the, holding the net up. She says, like, below, or like marking where the net is below. So the idea is that on the surface, you just see these little bobbing corks moving up and down. But below the water's surface, there's this vast net that kind of holds it all together. And you not see how the corks and their bobbing motions are related. They just look like individual discrete corks, but actually they're all related by this net underneath. And so that's what she means by these patterns. Anyway, I could go on, but if you read Mrs. Dalloway, that's where I started with it. I was like, it is filled with fluid dynamic vocabulary.
Right.
You can't hardly read a page where she's not using all these powerful process images of water and mist and smoke and spirals. And there's actually a line, back to Deleuze, a line that Deleuze quotes from his seminars, which have now, I believe, now been translated. We have them up on the Deleuze seminar website, so you can read Deleuze's seminars. But he has a really great one on Virginia Woolf, or a section where he talks about Woolf, I should say, where he quotes the line, "I'll never say again that I'm either this or that." To me, this is like a clear philosophical statement of indeterminacy. And she has several iterations throughout Mrs. Dalloway, where in this moment where she's seeing all these omnibuses spiraling around, and she's like overwhelmed by all the movement. And then suddenly she's like a knife cutting through the world. And Deleuze loves it. He's like really dramatic in the lecture. He's like saying this, about Woolf. And he's like, this is just like the best part of Woolf right here. We're like, she slices through the world like a knife. And I'm forgetting the exact word, but it's like not like so inside the world that one is outside, or something like that, where the inside and the outside no longer have this divisional meaning, where the inside becomes the outside, and the world, Woolf just kind of slices through it all like a knife. And in that moment, she realizes that she'd never say of anyone that they were either this or that. And that's a key statement of indeterminacy, is that the world isn't this or that. It's just not a thing at all. And I think Woolf really is a process thinker in that way.
Yeah, there was something you said that made me want to correct the paraphrase where you brought up the soul in Lucretius, and it was from A Thousand Plateaus, where they say souls are bodies, right? Because Lucretius, it's the lightest corpora. Again, I have to train myself not to say atoms, right? But the lightest bodies, the lightest corpora, they're the first to leave after death because the seal is broken. It made sense why Virginia Woolf would be featured in this book. I was curious about the genesis of discovering that link. That was what was unclear. That's really good. I know that.
Yeah, it's the Lucretius connection. The fact that she was so steeped in it. And Woolf scholars, there's a couple of them that talk about Lucretius, but he was a big deal. Woolf's father really loved Lucretius. Her brother loved Lucretius. It was like a family thing. I mean, it was like, there was a kind of atheistic family, at least on her father's side. And they're like, yeah, this is great stuff. And I think she grew up with that. And the Bloomsbury group, there's like the Bloomsbury group translated some Lucretius stuff too. It was like in the water, everybody there was thinking about Lucretius. And to me, that it solidified this connection with her in a way that other people, the link just isn't there. In this way, this was a big insight, actually, just writing this book, Matter in Motion. For me, one thing that I wasn't fully sure of until I kind of tried to hash it all out and write it was that Lucretius really is this linchpin, this bridge between the ancient and the modern world. He brings the ancient poetic sensibilities to the modern world, and only some of those moderns are wanting to actually hear that and go with it. And that's, I think, Marx and Woolf. And other people there's lots of other people, but they just can't fully affirm what Lucretius is saying. But I think really Marx and Woolf can.
I'm still trying to postpone the two digs, because the real question I want to ask is about the caution at the end of the book, because we could talk about that now. Actually, you do suggest caution because one of the things we brought up already with intoxication, experience, which, since we're doing etymology, or if with etymology in mind, right, goes back to the notion of taking risk, right, trying things out. And it does feel like one of the subterranean threads throughout the book is this question of experimentation. So I did want to ask, what was it that made you modulate your voice in that conclusion, suggesting that caution be taken if we start to go down this road of indeterminacy, let's say, relationality process, and giving them due primacy. What made you sort of self-aware that caution should be broached? Because obviously this reminds me of a lot of the caution advised in A Thousand Plateaus, right? Kind of looking back a little bit at Anti-Oedipus and a little bit of the worries that they were taken the wrong way, Deleuze and Guattari, as though they were saying like, just go wild, be schizophrenic, drop out, that kind of shit. I guess I'm wondering what made you put in that line about caution?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So that paragraph, I'm just looking back at it now.
And
I
the
guess
second to the last sentence too, I think, if I'm remembering the second, but there are similar dangers, and et cetera. So it's still there, but be cautious, but experiment, but taste of the fruit. May the fruits of all these alternatives be picked and eaten, right? Inspiring us to experiment. So you do end on this notion of experimenting, but obviously, I suppose that's, the body with organs can be botched, et cetera. I'm not trying, I guess Deleuze is on the brain, since I know we're going to ask about it, but I did want to just, I'm curious if you have any words about that. And if you do see this history of kinetic materialism suggesting us to experiment otherwise, ontologically, gnosiologically, etc.
I think that the sense in which I was kind of thinking about this and worrying about it a bit is that one might think, either after reading the book, Lucretius, Marx, and Woolf got it right, and all we need to do is like read what they say and then go do that. That there's something kind of, like, oh, the truth has been found. This means we ought to do X, Y, and Z about it. I wanted that to not be a takeaway that like, oh, this is somehow the right answer and all we need to do is like return to these things. But I mean, even then, well, what's the takeaway here? Like, should we have this indeterminate view of quantum physics? Should we do what Woolf was doing? Should we do what Marx was doing, or Lucretius? Like, I guess I just meant to not be like this normative imperative that any of these people in this book somehow got everything right. That's not the spirit of what I was trying to do. Was just trying to show that there's a connection. The three kind of, or three and a half, was like thematic things. That's what it's all about. But none of those on their own are going to give you like an answer to any particular political problem. Does that make sense? So the caution is like kind of a political caution. These aren't all the right answers. They're not going to even necessarily, like, big deal. So the other thing I have on my mind is, and a worry that I have about contemporary new materialism and vitalism, is there's just this kind of naive optimism about it.
Right.
The world is indeterminate, therefore we should be, and relational, therefore we should like care for other people and be nice and save the world and not destroy it ecologically. I mean, that sounds great. Like, I'm on board with that, but like, it doesn't follow from an ontological statement that the world, like, there's swerves. I mean, the world is swerving, therefore what? In my view, nothing follows directly from that. And to me, that's not like a weakness of like, oh, the inability of a process materialist perspective to give us any answers to concrete political problems. The point is like, when you give answers to political problems that are sort of grounded in ontology, you actually end up closing off politics. For me, politics really is about that antagonism and about that experiment. There is no pre-given solution to what to do. And certainly if there was, I'm not going to be the one to know it or even say, I mean, like, I just worry that one could come away with an optimistic view too, like, because Marx believed in indeterminacy and he was a communist, therefore we should do some version of communism that somebody says Marx said. No, I mean, it's not a substitute for really engaging with political experimentation. The point is thinking about the world from an ontological perspective of indeterminacy, relationality, and a process orientation. I think it's a pretty accurate description of the world that matches up with most of what the experimental evidence shows about the world, since we don't have any experimental evidence that there's anything static or that there are deterministic processes. Like, we don't have evidence of those things. So it's a good description, but it doesn't tell us what to do. But what it does do, okay, so if it doesn't tell us what to do, I think that's actually a good thing, because we should have to figure that out for ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean everyone, and figure out who the everyone is, who the we is, and then go from there and include all that we in the process. But there's no shortcuts to politics. You have to do it. And I don't want to shortcut that process by saying any particular political whatever follows from this. That said, there are some particular political things that don't follow from this, that are basically ontologically erroneous, and we have no evidence for them in any way. They're just ridiculous beliefs that are really doing more harm than good. And that is, to just shortly say, the great chain of being. That's one of the main enemies of this book and of the whole orientation here, is that whole great chain of being, all the way up and all the way down, having any ontological hierarchy. There's no basis for this. There's no observation of the world that's going to confirm this, unless it's a self-confirming one. You have a hierarchical world and you look around and you say, look at all the evidence of a hierarchical world. It's like, yeah, well, one that you made hierarchical, so it's just circular. My point is, there's lots of different ways that the world could be, and that's part of indeterminacy, means that it can be a lot of different ways, that it's not baked in great chain of being. So it's just like a clearing. It's like clears away at least some of, and I think a huge piece of rubbish, which is just metaphysical ideas of the great chain of being. Get that out of the way, and just, in a kind of Nietzschean sense, then you can get down to the real desires. Just say what you want. Don't hide behind metaphysical ideas of justice and nature wants us to do X, Y, and Z. Nature wants us to be good. Nature wants us to do X. No, nature doesn't want you to do anything. I mean, nature is wanting in general, nature is desire. So let's just be honest about what we're doing, which is expressing desires. And if you want equality, then just say you want equality. You don't have to ground it in something of the state or God or nature. Just want it. And people struggle. I mean, there's not a shortcut to that process. There's not an ontological ground of politics, and this is I think truly a Deleuzian inspired point about desire. And I find that in Lucretius for sure, with Venus being desire, and that being the opening major thematic of the book. Politics is desire, and you have to fuss that out. There's not a shortcut. So that's the caution, is don't think that these authors got it all right, or somehow we can look to them for everything, because there's also a whole other world of thinkers that are not in this Euro-Western tradition that are also worth engaging with and thinking with, and they don't have all the right answers either. It's not just a matter of romanticizing some text or some old thinkers, but what is important is at least getting rid of the great chain of being, so that we can be honest about what we're really doing.
That was a good answer. Yeah, I like what you said, and it makes sense in context. I do think it was a nice warning at the end, because a lot of it does seem like we need to be bold and move beyond a lot of what has kept us back. But at the same time, I can see now that the caution isn't just about experimentation, but about undue optimism. Coop, I did want to give you a chance, if you will, to jump in.
You mentioned kind of these ontological assumptions, and to me, one of the ones that I found most interesting, I mean, this even goes back to our last time you were on the show discussing Marx in Motion, and about how these kind of arbitrary decisions related to value, we kind of select who determines. This also applies to the sort of hierarchical aspect of what do we value, what gets valued in the system of capitalism, and this sort of arbitrary assumption that value is a thing, a discrete thing that's not part of a greater process, and to try to extract some type of atom of value from this greater process is just an ontologically flawed assumption already at the beginning, before you even get to politics or any of the other stuff. So I don't know. That's one thing that sort of stood out to me from the book in general. And even, like I said, went back to Marx in Motion. That's not so much a question as just a observation. So I don't know if you want to maybe draw that out a bit further, more specifically.
I'll just say that in the Marx in Motion book, that was a connection that I ended up making just after reading Marx's dissertation. Lots of other things became illuminated that he says in Capital. And one of those is he makes this direct connection between what capital does, the idea of value under capitalism, and the idea of atoms in materialism. That the idea is that you can just extract and think about, there really is this discrete thing. And that is a key feature of value, is that it treats things as discrete. And that's just not the way the world is. There is nothing that is ontologically discrete. So you have to admit at a certain level that capitalism is a game of make-believe. But again, this doesn't exactly get rid of capital, but it does shed some light. And you're not fooled that you're like, well, hey, it's just capital's just the nature of things. I mean, it lets you not fall down that path. But you could say, fine, it's just a game of make-believe. And I'm going to keep playing it until the world's dead. You know, I mean, you could
Right.
still do that. You could still say, fine, I agree that capitalism is a pattern of motion and it's all process, but it's one that I want to do and just redline it to the end. So, you know, you could still do that. Obviously, that's not what Marx hopes that you will walk away with from Capital. But still, I think that is a key point, is that it's just capitalism is a wrong definition of the world. It's just not an accurate description of reality. And if you follow it, I mean, you can make up all kinds of false things about the world and follow them out, but you're going to encounter some problems if you do that. And we are living through those problems right now. If you pretend like the world is something that it's not, you're going to have some problems. If you think you could just cut down trees from some part of the world, ship them to another part, and this is all going to even out, it's not. It's just not. Ecologically, it just won't. You can't just cut down trees and have them grow back in the same way. I mean, trees that have been there for 500 years, it's just not going to grow back in the same way, on the same time scale. You're going to exterminate all kinds of species. Anyway, there's all these consequences, so that you can't pretend like it's just a question of mere quantity. It's just not a question of mere quantity. There is no such thing as quantity alone. But that's the basis of the metaphysical lie of capitalism, is that you can treat things like they're quantities. Sure, but there's going to be some nasty consequences if you do.
You talked earlier a little bit about how even during the ancient Greek civilization, I forget which thinkers, but they're kind of looking at the countryside and seeing the sort of exploitation of nature or what have you at that point. That even draws this kind of same distinction. It's almost like this geography of the city. It creates this false barrier or like false division between ourselves and nature and like that process of life and whatever, the universe, etc.
The idea that for Plato, the idea that the Kora is passive, merely passive, is just wrong. I mean, just materially, descriptively wrong about the world. Like the Kora is not, the countryside is not passive. It's the only reason why the Greeks are alive, is because they've got a robust countryside. And if you treat it like it is passive and merely there for you to extract and cut up and build cities and have wars and cut down all the trees, if you treat it that way, you will encounter problems, which is exactly what happened. Ecological collapse of that whole Greek area. They destroyed the entire environment. I mean, it had huge ecological consequences and social and political, but it all is based on this idea that you think you can just destroy the Kora because it's just passive. The demiurge just takes a lump of stuff and shapes it into something awesome like the polis. If you think that, you're going to screw out everything up. It's just a bad idea. You can do it, but you're stupid for doing it. It's self-destructive.
It even kind of draws on this almost metaphysical notion of value, in the sense of your example earlier about the net and the way that on the surface of the water, you see the floats, but you're missing like all the activity that's below the surface. And I almost feel like this is the point, like we're so abstracted from the natural process of like the natural metabolism of how even our own economy works. It's like the Amazon package just magically appears at my front door. You know what I mean? It's like the problems with that are like obvious, as we've already kind of discussed. The religion is capitalism. It's like this metaphysical, like, oh, look, the market just magically delivers this product without understanding the labor that went into producing the product, whatever it may be. So,
yeah, it reminds me of that quote from The Big Lebowski. The dude is like, "You're not wrong, Walter. You're just an asshole."
Yeah.
It's like, there is a package, there is a product. You're not wrong. You're just an asshole. You can pretend all you want, but it's going to catch up with you. I think that's a pretty good ontological characterization of the situation.
I was just thinking, Coop, when you talked about the magical, I was thinking of like a stork would be a great, if Amazon is looking for a new logo, they could change it from the little smile to a stork. The stork deliver your package today. Anyway, I was wondering, because you brought up your chaos book, which is nice because we can already, part of the outro, we always ask what you're working on later. And I know you got a bunch of projects, but we have a Woolf book in the works and we have a chaos book. I guess I was wondering about, we do have the pre-Socratics, and as you say, the physiocrats or whatever, or not the physiocrats, the ionic physiologists, I think is what Simondon calls them. Heraclitus of fire, Thales of water, etc. And I was wondering about the Apeiron and its notion of being indeterminate, indefinite, and obviously this doesn't necessarily fit in the book. It didn't show up, but maybe that's something that will show up in your book on chaos, because the Apeiron would seem to fit in. I know that one of the definitions of one of the ways of translating it is as the indeterminate. And obviously it has relations to the Kora and Plato and whatnot, but is it Anaximander or an Anaxagoras? Maybe it's Anaximander and the Apeiron. I can't remember who first.
It's Anaximander, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be related to Hesiod's chaos to a certain extent, because the Apeiron would seemingly play into some of this indeterminacy, but maybe there isn't as robust of a literature. Obviously, Anaximander, we're pretty much reduced to the fragment, which brings in these odd notions of time and justice and sort of paying price for transgression, blah, blah, blah. But, which has probably been like interpreted to death, but still is kind of fascinating. In any case, I was wondering about if we will see, or if the Apeiron had come across your meditations on this subject of indeterminacy, and whether or not we'll see it in your chaos book.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up. Usually people bring up Heraclitus, and I hate answering the question because it's always like somebody who really loves Heraclitus. And then my answer is, I'm sorry, he's not in this group.
I agree with you, because in reality, you can't step into the same river once because it's not the same river, but whatever.
But also, for Heraclitus, he's a monist. He just is fire.
Right.
Fire.
Yeah.
This is an important distinction that Lucretius makes in book 2. All these other philosophers where there's an element that everything's made out of, that's monism or dualism, or even with the elements with Empedocles, that is not indeterminacy. Lucretius says no to all of those models. And sometimes when people hear me talk about Lucretius, they're like, oh, it's like a monism. I'm like, it's not a monism. Because what matter is not a substance. It's not.
Yeah, right.
So you can't have a monism if there's no substance. It's not a substance ontology. But as usual, people have a very hard time thinking outside of substance ontologies. As close as you're going to get is going to be Heraclitus. No, because not everything exchanges for fire. It's not all fire. Okay, so anyway, back to the Apeiron. I've been looking around here because I have a whole section that I wrote. It's like a really long footnote about Anaximander, because I went on a whole research thing about this because I thought it was very close and I wanted to follow up. I wish I could remember it, because it's quite specific what the problems are with it. But one here, I'm just going off of my memory, but I do have a footnote, a long one I can send you later on this. And I'm trying to remember even where I wrote it, but it's there.
I can always ask
somewhere.
This question when you come back with the chaos book, because if the chaos book is going to really be up our alley, then we do want to have you back for that. So you don't have to.
You know what? It might be in the chaos book. I think it is in the chaos book, actually. But let me just tell you the short answer is we have almost nothing from Anaximander. We have lots of testimonia, secondary people talking about him. We have one line that is supposedly from him, and it is not helpful. And it doesn't have any description of the Apeiron or anything. It doesn't give you anything. All we know is from other people. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that whatever people are saying about it is hundreds of years later by people who just somehow heard that he said this. So let's just keep in mind, we're not dealing with the primary texts here. We're dealing with secondary commentaries. The other thing is that when you do look at those commentaries, the one that is very close to him and that is authoritative in many other ways, not perfect, but that's Diogenes Laertius.
Yeah, you're right.
But even then, it's close, but even then, it's hundreds of years later after Anaximander. And what he says is that the Apeiron is completely deterministic.
Gotcha. Okay.
It is. So first of all,
that doesn't even make sense with the name itself. But
no, it does. It does. And here's why. Because the Apeiron, it's supposed to mean kind of unlimited. I think indeterminate is not a good translation of what that is, just because of Anaximander's usage of it. It just means that it's not bounded by space. In principle, that's fine. But the next step he takes, or at least according to, Diogenes, is it's deterministic. It follows natural determinate laws. And that is something that makes it not truly indeterministic. But I am with you that it's a thing to think about. And I'll send you the footnote, because I think it might be in the chaos book or elsewhere, but I've got all the citations and the details, and I triple, quadruple checked it because I thought for sure I was missing something, but really there's not. It's all secondary material, and the textual evidence that he's a determinist is solid. It's clear in the text that he does not mean anything that's indeterminate in the way that we're talking about with the swerve at all.
Right.
It's not relational. It's just all one stuff, but what that stuff is, it follows completely fixed laws.
This makes me think about so many of these ancient thinkers that would come into play here, how much of it is Sextus Empiricus, Diogenes Laertius. There is this question about this game of telephone. I was going to say overcoding, but this game of telephone of what gets transformed, or again, to bring up the major science, minor science thing, where it's like, it's trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, whatever, like things have to sort of fit into what seems more dominant in the contemporary tradition. That's another question. I mean, I was just thinking about this because I have seen Apeiron translated as the indefinite, as unlimited, as infinite, as maybe indeterminate is not quite etymologically close, but it's associated with it. I know Nietzsche goes on a fucking rant in his pre-Platonic seminars. I'll have to look up that too. But again, something we return to.
I also want to say really quick, I believe that for Anaximander, it's also spherical.
Okay.
The shape. And that too is going to be a no-no for, that's outside the tradition that I'm talking about. There's not going to be a shape.
Well, for Lucretius, there wouldn't have a shape. If it's really indefinite, why would it be bounded? Right?
Exactly. It does raise questions about Anaximander, or at least the consistency to which secondary commentators have attributed various things to him. But it's pretty standard. I think that it's almost every one of those early Greek philosophers who has a spherical cosmos. That's not an accident. It's true that Anaximander is he's like very early on the scene. He's really close on the heels of Hesiod, but ultimately Hesiod is already taken a step away. The chaos idea is great. And this is something I learned in the chaos book, is that Hesiod he's even steps farther away from chaos and indeterminacy than Homer does. But it's a gradual change from like the Minoans to Homer to Hesiod. But once truly you get to Anaximander and everybody after that, up to Lucretius, there really is no true ontological indeterminacy.
I almost don't feel like asking the Deleuze question, but we've been like hinting that we were going to get at it. And in my notes, I said we can do this loosely for fun. And so we've covered a lot of ground, and you've been very kind of like your book. You're covering a lot of ground concisely, and that's refreshing. It is refreshing sometimes to be able to cover broad swaths of ground and terrain without necessarily feeling like you're getting stuck in the mud. Although I did enjoy a lot of your footnotes where you do some of the deeper dives, like your footnote on chaos, which may be one of the longer footnotes in the book. So that was a hint that you were thinking about this at greater length. Obviously, I saw some resonances. I already brought one up about caution, right? Where it does seem like Deleuze and Guattari, the watchword of 1,000 Plateaus becomes caution, not necessarily a word we see in Anti-Oedipus, right? That in the intervening years, we see this, I want to say repentance. That might be a little bit harsh. But I mean, Deleuze talks about this in the Abecedare, which I mentioned before the show. He gets into a little bit of worry about, he's like, look, if someone's at the end of their life and their midlife crisis or whatever, and they're going to tune in, turn on, drop out, whatever, they're going to destroy themselves. That's fine. They've lived their life, but he hates to see, young people sort of de-stratifying too quickly or whatever the fuck. The impression he got was that they had inspired a little bit of an exorbitant relation to whatever it may be, intoxication, drugs, or he seems like he had a little bit of guilt or something like that. A little bit of conscience. It wasn't necessarily like Goethe and Werther where he's like inspiring people to jump off bridges and shit. But there were two digs, if I can even call them digs. You have the footnote. You already mentioned Nietzsche and philosophy and Deleuze taking Lucretius and Marx to task, even though that was fortuitous for you to like see this connection and lead you to Marx. I guess it was at the end of chapter 1 or chapter 2, you have the footnote about Deleuze subordinating matter and motion to force, which could be probably a broader thing that maybe you'll want to answer second. But the other dig I saw was, and I don't know if Deleuze ever actually uses the term flat ontology, but it seems like it's a phrase that is, and you may know better than I do, but it seems like a phrase that is associated with a certain strand of Deleuzianism, right? With demolishing hierarchies and these other things. this notion of a flat ontology seems to be associated with Deleuze. And you explain how in relationality, the change of any element involves a change of the whole, right? There is this kind of, doesn't necessarily imply an equality of beings or something like this, that the tessellation you're after is much more complex and nuanced and intertwined and entangled than one might think of in that phrase flat ontology. And I was wondering if you wanted to say a little bit more than that, because it was a kind of a cryptic aside, if you will. It just made my ears perk up, right? My eyes widen a little bit. And I was wondering about if there was a larger beef there. So I know that's a lot to answer. You don't have to go into all of that. I know that we talked about last time, which we didn't really go into. You had mentioned in Marx in Motion taken, or maybe it was in another book that I referenced, taking Deleuze to task for the Lucretius stuff, in Logic of Sense. So I guess this is the chance for you to maybe delve into that a little bit more, since we didn't go too deeply last time.
The Deleuze topic is quite large, but these two things I think I can answer pretty quick. The first one is not so much a dig. It's just kind of a matter of fact. In the Nietzsche book, Deleuze explicitly rejects both Lucretius and Marx's materialism in favor of Nietzsche's dynamism. That's not so much a dig, but it is just a note, for me, helped clarify a difference that I was finding in these thinkers. And one of the things ultimately that kind of puts Deleuze slightly in a different camp. And
subordinating matter and motion to force.
To force. And let me give you another example if that sounds like too abstract. In the appendix to Logic of Sense, he says, in a section which is all about Lucretius and Epicurus, he says that the swerve, it's not caused by anything exterior. That's right. But then he says it's actually because there's a conatus inside of matter. When I first read Deleuze, I was like, oh, that's cool. But then once I had read Lucretius and came back, I was like, actually, that's not cool. That's really not even textually supported at all. Lucretius in the entire De Rerum Natura never even uses the word conatus. Right. It's not part of the story. It's not part of Marx's story. It's not part of Lucretius's story. But you know whose story that is?
Right.
That is Spinoza. Okay. He takes his own version of Spinoza and the parts that he likes, and then he kind of reads that into there. But just from a nerdy, whatever textual perspective, that word does not occur. It is not an explanation that Lucretius uses. There is, importantly, no cause of the swerve. The swerve is self-caused or something. Like it's just, there's not just like a swerve over here and a swerve over there. Everything is swerving, Lucretius says, all the time. There's never a point when the world is not swerving. It just swerves in these kind of metastable patterns that look stable and real, like in reality. So anyway, the point is there that this force thing really, once I read that footnote, I was like, oh, that's what's up with that conatus bit where he gets that wrong. But it's because he's trying to inject force, some concept of buggery.
It's a little bit of buggery, right?
It's definitely some buggery.
He's trying to bugger Lucretius with Spinoza, a little artificial insemination going on.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I think that's what's going on. So that's just...
I swerve, therefore I am, is what I was thinking of. I swerve, therefore it is. I don't know. Okay, that makes sense.
Second one is also pretty easy about flat ontology. I think you're right. That's not something Deleuze, like a phrase he uses. It's something that other people attribute to him or say. Yeah. I just wanted to make it clear. I worry about that term politically. It has this kind of ring of that there's some kind of equality in being. And I just think that that's just not the right word for thinking about a swervy universe. You'd have something instead of that's flat, it'd be more topologically diverse. It's not to say that there can't be any hierarchies. I mean, that's again, back to the end of the book. Of course, little hierarchies can emerge. It's just important to note that there's no ontological necessity for them to emerge. They don't really have any grounds. I mean, yeah, somebody can be an asshole. Somebody can be a white supremacist and insist on some kind of racial or otherwise hierarchy. That's just going to happen. And that's part of reality, that can happen. It doesn't mean that it's good. It just can happen. It's not ontologically grounded, even if that person thinks that it is. My point is, I think it's better to think about, if we're going to think about like the way being is distributed, it's better to think about that more descriptively as like a mapping of a terrain that's really dynamic, where there are some hierarchies where they build up and then you can notice them and think about them. Hopefully it's not what they're thinking. people say that they're like colorblind. Oh, I don't see race. That's not a way out of racism. It's just pretending that there's no race. Like, oh, I don't see race. Like, first of all, that's rubbish. But also, like, that's not a good description of what's going on. So let's just give a better description and go from there. So again, not really so much a dig at Deleuze on that point.
I can't remember when I first came into contact with that phrase, flat ontology, but I do associate it with Deleuzean literature, not necessarily with Deleuze's terminology, though. So that's why I even like hesitantly put that out there. Like, I'm not sure. I was thinking of where that could come from. It could be, again, logic of sense, because there is a kind of Mobian type of discussion, right? Of as we go further, deeper down the rabbit hole of Alice in Wonderland towards Through the Looking Glass, the depth becomes surface, it becomes Mobian. Obviously, Crowned Anarchy, Discord and Accord was a phrase that I saw you citing Woolf, I guess her autobiography, where she uses almost a similar phrasing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think she says discord and harmonies, which could be another translation of Deleuze's French. So it's not all digs, obviously. It's not all, but obviously some distances there. And I guess that I would just say, even in Deleuze, if being is said in a single sense, right, there is still an inequality that comes out of that, which I suppose he would want to find in the differential, etc. But yeah, I guess we're getting a little bit into the weeds there. Those were the two things that I just had like as an aside, kind of like inside baseball, but it's stuff that we do cover Deleuze here a lot. So it's one of those things where it'd be like a little bit of an interesting footnote to a footnote, right?
There's a lot to say, but it's probably best to just refer. I think it's like chapter 3 of Being in Motion. I have a whole chapter that's just very textual, looking at all the places where Deleuze says stuff that is honestly a little confusing, but certainly a mixed bag. But it's important to look at the text and see what he says about movement, because it's easy to get confused. Like, it took a lot of work to find all that stuff. But in the end, I think it's much more ambiguous how much Deleuze is really kind of committed to a certain version of indeterminacy. Even though there are places, again, where he seems to be saying it, like Indifference and Repetition might be some of the strongest places where he does explicitly talk about indeterminacy. But then the stuff he says about the swerve and some things he says about stasis and motion are a little bit, they don't quite fit, but it's certainly more interesting it's a more complicated story than either Bergson or Whitehead. I think he kind of merges the two together. That's the short story there. I think he really he's like really like the ultimate process philosopher who wants to synthesize the two greatest process philosophers, Bergson and Whitehead, bring them together and make this kind of ultimate process philosophy. But in the end, I think he ends up kind of taking on what was problematic about both Whitehead and Bergson. Even though he gets both the good stuff, he also kind of gets all their bad stuff too. So I'm not sure if it like fully overcomes some of the problems of process philosophy, but it's a very valiant attempt to do so.
Yeah, that's good. And that's food for thought and could be a whole episode. So I don't want to go too, we've already gone down a couple of rabbit holes, right? So we can save some terrain for later. I will see I want to leave space for any Coop, if you had any other questions that you had, and I do want to leave time to talk a little bit more, Thomas, for what you're doing in the future. We've already talked about a little bit, but there might be some other things you haven't brought up. But yeah, I suppose we can.
I think my
floor open. Yeah, go ahead.
My final question may help us transition or like segue into that. This is purely vibes based, so please bear with me. But I was wondering, okay, in the Chaos book, are you going to be, just to give us a little bit of a preview, are you going to be engaging with Guattari's chaosmosis? In reading this book and your mentions of Virginia Woolf, I was thinking, because I think the term chaosmosis Guattari gets from Joyce.
Yeah.
Another, stream of consciousness, whatever, if you want to consider that the genre of Woolf and Joyce as writers or what have you. So just kind of curious if that was influencing your writing or it's going to make an appearance at all in the Chaos book.
The Chaos book is very much going back in time and not forward, but it's given me a greater appreciation for modern authors who are thinking about chaos seriously. And I include for sure Joyce, Woolf, and Deleuze and Guattari in those categories. I think to me, that's one of the things that really does mark them out from many others in like 20th century stuff is how much they're willing to kind of commit to certain ideas of chaos without going full like Kenton Meyasu or the hyper chaos, which I think is just, I think that's just wrong and ridiculous nonsense, to be honest. I think it's not at all even remotely close to what's going on in Joyce, Woolf, or Deleuze and Guattari. It's just like pure randomness, ex nihilo randomness. And that is nothing to do with the swerve or relationality or any of these things we're talking about. That's just pure idealism. Even though he calls it materialism, that's not materialism in this tradition. The answer is, it just goes, the Chaos book really investigates. I told you the story of coming back to the early pre-material versions of materialism in the Euro West. And that sort of led to really thinking about the word chaos in Hesiod and wondering a similar question of like, well, where did he get this? I mean, I know Guattari, and the story of how somebody like Guattari would get a hold of this idea is much more clear than where Hesiod, because other than Hesiod, literally there's no other usage of that word prior to Hesiod. And even in Hesiod, he uses it 3 times in the whole text. We really don't even, and the etymology of this is very uncertain. People speak more confidently about it than we actually know for sure of like where this word even came from. And also, who cares where it came from? I mean, I care kind of where it comes from, but however Hesiod's going to use it, he can use it however he wants. It's not determined by where he got it. It's clearly influenced. In any case, the point is I got very much into thinking that if indeterminacy is there in Lucretius, I wondered if Hesiod might have been an inspiration in thinking about, because in book 5, Lucretius's description of the origin of the cosmos is basically Hesiod. You know, it's like there's indeterminate swervings in the beginning that then begin to crystallize and form into the first stuff. It's very a kind of chaos. I mean, it's not my term, but I use the term a lot in the book because it's perfect. But Catherine Keller uses the term chaosmogony, and it's perfect. So it's like a cosmogony where chaos is first. And that's what I try to do in the book, is trace all of the world's chaosmogonies and show in the text exactly how the story unfolds and what's common across Mayan and Polynesian and Japanese and Norse and Egyptian and Chinese and many more. The conclusions are too big to present to you now. I'll just have to leave those for later, because I would just say them and they'd sound like, you better have some evidence for that, because I do have the evidence, and that's what was really cool. This project was, I really wasn't sure what was going to happen, and it was kind of kept me on the edge of my seat every time, because I wasn't really sure if there was even a thing that was going to be coherently, you could even call chaos across so many different languages, cultures, time periods, geographies, that there would be anything like chaos. And that word's not even used in all those places. Only Hesiod uses it. I'm taking a little bit of liberty in calling them all this. My point is, Hesiod is only one instance. He happens to be a very influential instance for Lucretius, but he's only one instance of a much larger world historical tendency of the world's oldest cosmogonies to all begin with chaos. And I think what that gives you when you start with chaos, they all have to do with indeterminacy, they all have to do with process, and they're all relational. And you can see that those are the ideas that like I've been kind of kicking around in this book and other books. Lots of conclusions. One being the idea of new materialism, or the idea of ontological indeterminacy. This is not like my idea I pulled out of a hat. Yeah, I came to it just, in a tradition like everybody else, coming to Lucretius, digging. And if you dig far enough, you realize it's a pretty old idea. It's a pretty widespread idea. It might be one of the single widest spread ideas of this kind of magnitude on the planet. I mean, ever, as far as we know in the textual record. It's hard to think of a bigger idea, but for that reason, it's also hard to think of a more crushing and sort of devastating world historical event, which was the disappearance and the death of chaos around the world. And so I track both. The name of the book is called The Birth of Chaos, both because it's about sort of tracking how chaos emerges in these cultures, but also that chaos is really about birth, and that, if you will, the death of birth was a very important moment. And it's not isolated in the 6th century BCE, but that's a big turning point where many of the worlds, starting in Eurasia, where we have these texts, you can see that chaos falls out of the record. It's not primary anymore at a certain point. There's a point in time in which it is, and everything comes out of chaos and everything goes back to chaos. And that's a world, that's a worldview. Really, really different. There's no foundation for the great chain of being. It's impossible. Yeah, you can have people kill each other and come up with little kind of regional hierarchies for sure, but they could never ground those ontologically, because if everything came from chaos and everything returns to it, that's it. It's not flat. It's a process. That is, everything is destroyed. That's a really specific, widespread worldview that ends up being crushed at a certain time in Eurasian history. And then once it's crushed, you see the rise of all kinds of monotheisms and philosophies, both West and East. And then that travels through modern colonialism. So ancient colonialism is one kind of weapon of getting rid of chaos. And then modern colonialism, I just track and see, you can see wherever Indo-European influenced peoples and languages go, they end up transforming the indigenous stories where we still have records of them. You can watch them in these texts be transformed with the removal of chaos and the appearance of Christ and God and all that stuff. It's
Right.
pretty clear. So anyway, it's kind of tracking the birth and death of chaos in this tradition. I think it'll shed a lot of light. It has for me on what it is that Deleuze and Guattari are even kind of getting at, like why'd they go there with this? But I do think it's one of the cooler things that distinguishes them, the way that they're willing to commit to such an archaic idea and work with it and run with it and still keep somewhat close to the idea of chaos. It shed some light on that for me. The refrain chapter in A Thousand Plateaus, where they're talking about in the beginning is kind of chaos, and then there's is it like the kid who sings a little song to himself and starts this refrain? But that image of singing in the beginning of sound is also really important. They're not citing all the world mythology, but that's a pretty common thing, is that chaos begins and there's some kind of heat or a song or some kind of little something or an egg that begins to resonate. And of course, the Dogon egg and all that stuff. But I mean, even though that mythology is extremely suspicious, that was probably not actually very valid for the Dogon people. I've researched that, and it's a cool story. It really is, but nobody's been able to verify that the Dogon people really believed that. And it wasn't just some not crazy, but just some dude who had a view of the world and shared it with an anthropologist in the 70s. And now nobody has ever been able to validate it or confirm it by any other Dogon person. So, but the image of the egg is all over the place. It's not unique to the Dogon. Anyway, that's the Chaos Project, but that's not the theses of the project. That's just kind of the outline of what I've tried to do, but it has big implications.
Yeah, the refrain, a little bit of warding off of chaos. What is...
Oh, you're right. There's the warding off. No, that's actually, now that I think about that, is actually really different. That's totally an Eliade point. In the book, that's really not the conclusion. I mean, with tons of evidence that I end up coming to showing in the text, this is not... Anyway, he's really not a very close textual scholar. He just says stuff and that it's true. And then there's no citations of the original languages. He's not even engaging with the primary text half the time. Right. And Deleuze, I think, is just following in that Eliade moment, but it's not about warding off chaos. I just want to emphasize that in the text. When you look at the primary documents and the primary language, you see this is not about warding off chaos. It's about chaos. Everything just is chaos too. It's just chaos gets woven and iterated into the world that then goes back into the chaos. It's not a question of warding it off. It's not order versus chaos. It's just chaos all the way down that gets metastably structured into things that are it's not quite order. It still is chaos in it. It's not warded off. It's not there's this conflict between order and chaos that Eliade makes it out to be. And I think Deleuze, you're right, is following into that.
This is why in What is Philosophy, it's a little bit different, where it's about sifting chaos. They turn to Lawrence, right, where it's about opening up. There's been this umbrella that's the ward off chaos, but the thinker and the artist have to open up little sections back out to chaos, right?
So,
So we sometimes get a little bit complacent with the sifts and the sieves, and we have to be able to open them up a little bit more in different ways so that we can let a little chaos in. And I think that question of warding off could be overcoded by Eliade, but I do think in What is Philosophy, they go back to the chaoids, right, of art, science, philosophy, etc. Again, we'll have to defer that for later, and I look forward to that. Do you think that'll appear sometime this year? Have you submitted? I guess, are you still fine tuning
I'd say next year is probably more realistic. Like I've got the manuscript done. I need to go back and edit it to clean it up a lot and fix all my footnotes. No, to shape the metastability of the chaos.
Right. Gotcha.
And then, I think probably next year for that one. And the Woolf one, I hope, I mean, if it works out, hopefully that one will be this year. It could be next year. And then there's a book called The Philosophy of Movement, which is just like an introduction, because now I've just like written so much stuff, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to really read it and engage with it. And I'm glad that this one could be short enough that it's like you can do it and not feel too bad if you read too much stuff to have a conversation. But I appreciate you taking the time on it anyway. But now that I've like kind of, there's quite a bit out there, it's like, this is just too overwhelming. Where do you even start? What's the point of it all? So there's a book coming out with University of Minnesota that'll be out, I think, this September. That's just kind of like an introduction to this is like more of an introduction to the kind of the thinkers, the trajectory, Minoans through Lucretius and so on. But the other book that's coming out will just be kind of, it's more like the philosophical stuff of like how art, science, politics, ontology are all kind of connected and through the histories. So it's just like a condensed version, hopefully, with like a whole kind of like a response to like various criticisms and questions that people have asked over the years. In the back section, I just kind of, enough of those have built up where I feel like it'd be helpful to respond to a lot of those to help clarify and just respond to criticisms and questions. So anyway, that'll be out in September. And then the other book
I was going to say a brief introduction to the philosophy of nihilism.
Right? I don't know about nihilism, but
let's not append an ism. Let's avoid it. No, what's the third book?
So this one is also done in draft form. This one I can't say for sure will be next year or the year after, but it's a history of consciousness book. So it's like evolution, neuroscience, psychology, not philosophy of mind, but basically a kind of a materialist view of the history of consciousness, dealing with things like the unconscious and animal evolution and psychiatry and some politics.
Our most recent episode, we got to talk a little bit about the project, Freud's project, right? So you get to get a little bit of that. What is it? A month or two ago, I brought up fucking Julian Jaynes out of nowhere, right? The bicameral mind and all that. So I just assumed that you might have a footnote on it or something, in the consciousness book. He is going into some of that mythological stuff, or he's even going to Odysseus, right? When Odysseus engages Athena, it's actually, a part of his mind has to be externalized to give him the order, to give him some insight. It's externalized rather than it being this internal dialogue. Anyway, maybe that's not very interesting to you, but
no, it is.
That was one of the, I just meant for your book. That was one of the books in my parents' library growing up. And I remember reading it and being kind of fascinated about this interesting theory about the birth of consciousness. The Athena appearing, like the gods being these externalizations of a kind of internal monologue.
I do have a chapter where I engage with that thematic about the origins of, the sort of origins of religion. I mean, it's about kind of animism and perception and pareidolia and mirror neurons and stuff like that. So it's going to be in there.
The Minoans come back maybe a little bit.
Well, animism comes back, but the Minoans, I think, are just one instance of a much larger kind of embodied cognitive thing called animism. But again, animism not from the 19th century colonial anthropology idea. Exactly. It's not just like humans making a mistake by thinking nature is animate.
Freud kind of has that idea, right? Doesn't Freud kind of run through some of the prejudices against animism in Totem and Taboo? He kind of, or maybe it was Civilization is Sixth Intense, or maybe both. He's kind of doing a parody of, doesn't matter. And the other thing was, it made me think of Rousseau's idea of the origin of consciousness, where he's like, at one point everybody was sitting around the fire and they're all singing and there's all equality and everybody's chill. And then there's like this moment, when someone notices that someone else is singing a little bit better or doing something a little bit better. And now there's hierarchy, right? It's just, it's like this flash of insight and where jealousy arrives on the scene. Anyway, no, but all of that sounds fascinating. And I'm not surprised you've got several projects concurrently. That's how you keep the pace going. You're prolific and proliferative, just like Venus, right? At the beginning of the term Natura, right? Of all of these things flowering and I love that the opening lines, right, where he's talking about Venus makes everything proliferate, right, even the beasts in the field and etc. There's almost a different origin story than you see like in Genesis, where it's just, instead of it just being this kind of like top down creation, here's some plants, here's some animals. Venus is like inspiring. I think that's one of the words, right? It may even be a Latin word. There is this inspiration of love to like be fruitful and multiply.
Hebrew Bible, though, just to be clear about, like, because I think in that story, there is certainly some kind of asymmetry, but in the beginning, there's no explanation of the tohu wabohu and tehom, like the deep, the void. These are things that are just there. And this is a residue. I mean, this is leftover from what was probably like Semitic, probably versions of Semitic animism, probably have this residue of a chaosmogony. But once you get to the writing of the text in Genesis, it's pretty late. I mean, I'd be absolutely surprised if it had retained its chaos features after so many years of influence by other Indo-European cultures in the area. But once they end up writing it down, there's also this figure of Yahweh or Elohim, and he's just there too. There's no explanation of why either of them are there. The chaos one, to me, that makes sense because almost everybody has that version where like there is no explanation of chaos. Chaos just is constantly becoming. There's no being, there's no not being, it's just becoming. But then the Yahweh story, he's just like there. So they're both co-posited, but still a co-positing is really different than just having chaos. In fact, it's like completely, it makes all the difference. And Hesiod, same deal. Actually, it's slightly different. In Hesiod, you start with chaos and then Gaia comes into being, but he never says that Gaia is born from chaos. He just says she comes into being. But she comes to being second, but since she doesn't come from chaos, she can never go back to chaos. Same thing with Yahweh. Yahweh, if he doesn't come from chaos, he can never go back to chaos. That means he's eternal and he's never going to die. And that violates the basic idea of a chaosmogony where everything has to die. Ragnarok's coming and everything's going to be consumed. That's like the key thing that makes that happen is all the gods are going to die. They'll be born and they're going to die. And then more gods will be born. It's same with Atum in ancient Egypt. He says, he creates the world, but he's like, I'm going to destroy it and then destroy myself and everything will return back to the waters of none, back to the darkness. And that's really crucial. Like the thing that keeps that from happening is Yahweh is never going to go back. Gaia never going to go back. And that's this like that's the beginnings of a way out of chaos is to never have to go back to it. Like you said, warding it off, but like really warding it off so that you never have to tangle with it again. And that's the danger. Is not having this ongoing relationship with chaos and just being done with it, moving on to eternity and, Zoroastrianism and monotheism and, all those versions are just ways of getting out of the problem of chaos.
I do think the warding is an interesting, I have to look at the French. It might be conjure, because the notion of warding goes back to also anti-Oedipus, right? Where the primitive territorial machine. They ward off. They ward off the specter that haunts them. Yeah, right. That itself is suspect because warding isn't necessarily successful, right? So it's okay. Well, Thomas, I mean, we could obviously, we could obviously talk for hours indefinitely, indefinitely. But thank you for coming back on the show. I really enjoyed getting to dig into more of your work. Still a lot more to dig into. I've tried to like jump into each one of the books, but I haven't gotten to like, besides Marx in Motion in this book, I haven't read them cover to cover. So at some point I'm going to do more of that. And I do look forward to the book on chaos. If you say it was written for people like us, I'm excited for it. And I think that's a good reason to have you back. But I appreciate your time. Obviously, appreciate your sharing with us. And I hope you keep working because I appreciate your work.
Thanks, guys. I love talking to you guys. We could talk for hours and hours and hours. Thanks again for taking the time to read the book and
absolutely
engage with it in this way. It's great.
Well, we're going to stay on just a little bit, but we're going to let you go to enjoy your weekend. So have a nice weekend. Thanks again for coming on, and let's keep in touch as always. And just if you find that footnote, if you get a chance, share it with me, on Apeiron. I would love to see that. Then that can form the basis for a discussion next time.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to make a note right now and do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas.
Because I'm going to forget if I don't do it right now.
No,
thanks, Cooper.
Have a great day.
Yeah, have a good weekend, guys. Bye.
Thanks again to Thomas Nail for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very rules of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.